Welcome to Formosa Dream Chasers.
We're your hosts, Mary Anne
and Dicang.
Please join us as we explore the journeys amazing people take in pursuit of their dreams.
And get insights from their experiences.
Let's hit the road
and get started.
Hello, and welcome back to Formosa Dream Chasers with me, your host, Mary Anne Sioco. For those tuning in for the first time, Formosa Dream Chasers is a show about ordinary people who have stepped outside of their comfort zones and taken a chance on themselves, on their passions, and on their dreams. We sit down with people from all walks of life and talk about what it really takes to build something meaningful, whether that's here in Taiwan or elsewhere. Over the last few episodes, I've been sharing a series of personal reflections. We've talked about what it feels like to be in the middle of the journey when you're not quite where you want to be yet. And we've talked about the sacrifices we make while pursuing our goals. And we've also talked about what happens when achievement itself starts losing its meaning. Recently, I also had the opportunity to sit down with Philippine Labor Director David Des T. Dicang for a 3-part interview discussing migration, overseas workers, and what he's learned from more than 3 decades of serving Filipinos abroad. And after those conversations, I found myself reflecting on migration in a very different way. Because when people talk about migration, we usually talk about it through numbers. We talk about labor. We talk about economics. We talk about policies. It's always statistics. But beneath all those statistics are real people. People making difficult decisions. People leaving behind familiarity. And people taking risks. People hoping that somewhere beyond the horizon is a better future. And as I thought about Director Dicang's stories and my own experiences here in Taiwan, I realized that migration taught me 2 lessons I never really expected. The first one is how to start over, and the second is how to build a home in a place that was never supposed to be a home. Because if we're being honest, most people don't leave home because they want to become beginners again. They leave because they're pursuing something. A better opportunity, a better education, a safer future, more financial stability, a chance to grow. More than anything, migration is usually driven by hope. And that's something Director Dicang talked about throughout our conversations. Many people leave because they want to provide better lives for their families. They want better educational opportunities for their children. They want financial stability. They want to create options that may not have been available to them before. And while every migration story is unique, that desire for a better future is something many of us share. I know I had the same hopes and dreams. Years ago, I graduated with a degree in communications, which I also shared with you in an earlier episode. And I mentioned that that particular decision was not exactly popular within my family. You know, coming from a traditional Chinese background, my parents had a very different vision of what success looked like. They wanted me to pursue something more practical, something more stable, something like medicine or business, a career path that had a clearer roadmap. But communications was what interested me. It was what I wanted to study, and it was what I could genuinely see myself doing. And so after many difficult conversations, many disagreements, and more than a few arguments, they eventually agreed. And at the time, I thought the difficult part was over. I thought that once I graduated, everything would naturally fall into place. I thought the path would be straightforward. Boy, was I wrong. After graduation, I struggled to find the kind of opportunities I had envisioned for myself. And naturally, there were numerous moments where I heard those familiar words from my family. I told you so. And if you've ever pursued something that other people didn't believe in, you probably know exactly how that feels. Every setback feels amplified. Every failure feels like proof that maybe everyone else was right. And eventually, because of that, I started looking for other opportunities. And it was at the time that I felt that I had enough space to look into improving my Mandarin, and that decision eventually brought me to Taiwan. When I came to Taiwan, I wasn't planning to stay long term. I wasn't imagining a future here. And like many migrants, students, overseas workers, I thought that this would simply be one chapter in a much larger story. A temporary stop, a stepping stone, a place that I would eventually leave behind. But migration sometimes has a way of rewriting our plans. And once you arrive at somewhere new, you quickly discover that starting over is far, far more difficult than you imagined. And quite honestly, nobody really prepares you for that. Because people often focus on the big challenges. The paperwork, the visa applications, the logistics, and the cost. And the harder part is actually something else. It's learning and accepting that you now have to become a beginner again. When we're children, being beginners is normal. Everything is new, everything is unfamiliar, we're expected to learn, we're expected to make mistakes. But as adults, we spend years building competence. We build careers. We develop expertise. We create routines. And we become more comfortable. Migration, quietly but decisively, removes many of those things. Suddenly, you're navigating a language that isn't your own, a culture that operates differently, a workplace with different expectations, and a society where many of the rules are unspoken. And even simple tasks can become surprisingly complicated. You become aware of how much of daily life depends on the things you've always taken for granted. What happened to me was after I came to Taiwan and settled into my Mandarin learning classes, I also eventually started to teach English. And then later on, I worked in marketing and then public relations. And eventually, I found my way to Radio Taiwan International, into the path that I felt happiest at. But looking back, the journey may seem logical, but while I was living through it, it honestly did not feel that way at all. You know, there were many stops and pauses in between. And definitely at the time, it felt very much uncertain, very messy, and extremely disconnected. It was like I was constantly starting over. And maybe that's why I think one of the greatest skills migration teaches us is adaptability, not resilience and not perseverance. Although those are important too, but being adaptable, having that ability to become a beginner again without allowing your pride to get in the way, the ability to learn, to adjust and to remain curious, to keep moving forward, even when you don't fully know what you're doing or where you're going. Director Dicang mentioned that one of the strengths employers often see in Filipino workers is how quickly they learn and adapt. And I think that observation extends beyond Filipinos. It applies to migrants everywhere, because migration forces you to develop that skill. You don't really have a choice. You learn how to ask questions, you learn how to solve problems, but most of all, you learn how to navigate uncertainty. And perhaps most importantly, you learn that starting over is not failure, it's growth. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone considering migration, it would be this. Don't be afraid of imperfect beginnings. Your first job may not be your dream job. Your first apartment may not feel like home. Your first year may be full of mistakes. And you may feel lost. You may feel behind. You may question whether you made the right decision. And that's completely normal. Because migration isn't really about arriving somewhere. It's about learning how to rebuild. And rebuilding always takes time. But migration teaches another lesson as well. And this one arrives often much later. Because eventually, if you stay long enough, you stop asking yourself how to survive. And then you start asking yourself how to belong. In the beginning, everything is temporary. You tell yourself you'll only stay for a few years. And you keep one foot in your old life and another foot in your new one. So you avoid becoming too attached. You avoid thinking too far ahead. But life being life, it continues moving forward. You make friends, you develop routines, you find favorite restaurants, and then you discover neighborhoods that you enjoy. You start celebrating holidays, and you create memories. And slowly, without realizing it, something begins to change. You're no longer simply living in a place, and you're becoming part of it. And for me, there wasn't one dramatic moment when Taiwan suddenly became home. There was no grand realization, no life-changing event. Instead, it happened quietly, very much gradually, and through everyday experiences, through friendships, through work, and through community. Through all of those small moments that never seemed important while they were happening. And then later on, one day I realized that Taiwan wasn't simply a place where I lived anymore. It had become a part of my life. And I think that's something many migrants experience. Home isn't always where we expect to find it. Sometimes home emerges from familiarity, from connection, and from belonging, from the people we meet and the lives we build. But I think it's also important to acknowledge another challenge that many migrants face, and it's something we don't talk about nearly enough. And that's the danger of becoming too comfortable. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not saying that comfort is bad. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with enjoying life. And there's nothing wrong with finding happiness. There's nothing wrong with building friendships, traveling, exploring, and creating a life that you genuinely enjoy. Those things matter. And in fact, they're part of what makes migration very much worthwhile. But there's a huge difference between comfort and complacency. And, in our previous episode, Director Dicang often spoke about preparing for the future, developing skills, continuing education, building career pathways, creating opportunities beyond your current circumstances. And I think that's incredibly important because migration is often temporary, even when it doesn't feel that way. Time passes by very quickly. A 2-year plan can become 5 years, and later on, 5 years becomes 10. And before you know it, an entire chapter of your life has gone by. And if we're not careful, we can become so comfortable in our routines that we stop growing. We stop learning, we stop preparing, and we stop asking ourselves where we're headed. One of the realities of migration is that opportunities abroad are not just meant to improve our present. They're also meant to help build our future. So while it's important to enjoy life, it's equally important to continue investing in ourselves. Learn the language, develop new skills, take some courses, build financial security, and think about where we want to be 5 or 10 years from now. Because migration should not only improve our immediate circumstances, it should also expand our possibilities. And I think the healthiest approach is finding balance. To build a life, but also build a future. To enjoy the present, but not to neglect tomorrow. We create memories, but we continue growing. Because comfort should never become the reason why we stop evolving. And perhaps that's where community becomes so important. If we look back into our last episodes, Director Dicang repeatedly returned to one thing, and that is community, where he was talking about workers helping one another through difficult times, the support organizations in Taiwan, and the importance of contributing to society. So his message was remarkably consistent. None of us can build a life alone. And the longer I live here in Taiwan, the more that I see that this is true. The people who adapt the best are rarely the people who try to do everything themselves. These are the people who build relationships, and these are also the people who ask for help. They're the ones that participate, and they're also the ones that contribute. One of the biggest mistakes migrants can make is waiting until they feel lonely before building community. It's important to build before you need it. So join organizations, volunteer, attend events, meet people, and create connections. Perhaps I could say that's one of the biggest lessons migration has taught me. Starting over is definitely not failure. It's a skill, a very difficult skill, an extremely uncomfortable skill. But it is a skill nonetheless. And that home isn't necessarily where you were born. Home can be the place where you grew, the place where you struggled. It can be the place where you become a different version of yourself. And over the years, Taiwan has become that place for me. Not because I planned it, and not because I knew exactly where I was going, but because life unfolded in so many ways that I never could have predicted. I believe that's true for many of us. Migration isn't simply about moving from one country to another. As Henry Miller once wrote, one's destination is never a place, but a new way of seeing things. And perhaps that's what migration gives us more than anything else. It's simply not a new country, but a new perspective on who we are, what matters to us, and what it truly means to belong. Thank you for listening to Formosa Dream Chasers. I'll see you next time.